Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Really pleased to have you here. We have an exciting panel lined up. We have 6 speakers here, all addressing issues related to managed retreat that are a bit different from coastal issues, which I think has dominated and takes over the majority of our attention in this conference. So there's people here speaking to us about wildfire, mountain issues, and other non-coastal dimensions of retreat. So my name is Lisa Dale. I work here at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. I'll be chairing this session. And without further delay, I will introduce our first speaker. We're going to have all 6 speakers present in succession, and then at the end, we will have questions. So we have hosts who are keeping an eye on the question box. So if you are watching these talks and have questions, feel free to throw them in the question box, and we will address them all, gather them all up, and try to make some sense of them at the end of the talk. So stick around. So I'm really happy to introduce our first speaker, Kimiko Barrett from Headwaters Economics.
Great. Thank you so much. So I am waiting for the ability to share my screen. If that can happen. There we go. All right. Here we go. Okay. So thank you so much for that, Lisa. My name is Kimmy Barrett. I am a wildfire researcher and policy analyst with Headwaters Economics. And we are a nonpartisan independent research group based in Bozeman, Montana. And I'll be talking about wildfire risks, what we're looking at presently with these risks, what that might project into the future for some of these trends, and then some tools for decision makers at multiple scales of decision making. I'm really going to set the context for my fellow panelists. I'm not going to get into the managed retreat concept too much and as it relates to wildfires, and instead, again, just try and set the dialogue and understanding for what the current situation around wildfire really looks like. I think it's important within this context, with managed retreat, the theme of this conference and wildfires, to really think about the scale of the issue. And I know that this is something that my predecessor panelists are going to get into with more detail, but that's really kind of the confounding challenge we're dealing with wildfire. And I'm going to shed some light on that with some of these statistics. And I hope I don't do too much of a sticker shock with you in going through some of these slides, because I'm going to start with some risks and trends, again, setting where we're at with current wildfire risks, where we're going into the future, and then some tools for decision makers, and then leave it off to the fellow panelists to get into more details. So let's look at this, risks and trends. We know wildfires are increasing in duration, severity, and frequency. At the same time, more homes are being built in wildfire-prone lands, increasing both the risks and the costs. Let's look in this in more detail here. What are we talking about? 84 days is about the average extension of the wildfire season. So about 3 months, summer's coming a little bit earlier, fall's lasting a little bit longer. This is for the Western United States. It's also been indicated across the globe where there's been about an average extension of about 20% in the so-called fire season. In many places, there is no longer a season and wildfires are occurring on a year-round basis. Additionally, there's been a 700% in the numbers of acreages burned by highly severe wildfires since 1984, or 85 rather. This of course has direct implications for soil rejuvenation, organic material content, landscape rehabilitation, many things that go into the ecosystem functionality during a post-fire process. So 700% increase, that's pretty substantial. 75% of US forests have become significantly drier. This is directly tied to an earlier snow melt and a longer fire season. And as a result of all of these concurrently driving forces, there's been a substantial increase in the number of structures lost. The conservative count is that about 90,000 structures have been destroyed since 2005. Many of these have come from California, as we've heard in the media, such as the Camp Fire in 2018, burning through the town of Paradise, in which nearly 19,000 structures have been destroyed. Perhaps more significant is that most of these losses have occurred in just the past 5 years. So wildfire costs for suppression, meaning the cost spent by firefighters mostly in containing and extinguishing a wildfire, those are the upfront costs spent by the federal government, have more than doubled since 1999, now averaging over $65 million per wildfire. Also, as in correlation to this, insurance costs are starting to rise in terms of what are the submitted insurance claims following a wildfire. In California alone, they came to $13 billion in 2020. So all the costs on all fronts are rising. 97% of wildfires that start in what is known as the wildland-urban interface, or that area in which houses intermingle with unbuilt or undeveloped vegetation, is actually started by humans. This is 30 times more than lightning or naturally caused ignitions. So most wildfires are actually started by people. And at the same time, as I said earlier, more homes are being built in harm's way. So 34%, or more than 1 in 3 homes, are now located in these wildfire-prone landscapes. That's roughly 44 million people or households within the United States, and over half of the West's population. It is the fastest growing land use type in the country and has increased 145% since 1990. These are conservative counts and do not take into consider any trends in development during the COVID and 2020 exodus. The problem is likely to get worse into the future. So what are we supposed to do about this? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some tools that are being used at the community, county, state, and even the national level to help identify, understand, and reduce this increasing risk alongside other challenges. So the first one I want to talk about is Wildfire Risk to Communities. This is a website that was done in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service, a wildfire modeling company out of Missoula called Pyrologics, and Headwaters Economics. When you enter the website, you immediately are confronted with 3 different pathways in which to understand, explore, and reduce wildfire risk. I'm only going to talk about the central one, which is Explore. This is the main dashboard and portal for a user to identify where risk is relative to their geography and then explore it in further detail. So once you click on this as a user, you're immediately sent to a search index in which you can look by state, county, or community for a certain geography of your choosing. I'm going to go ahead with Monterey County, California, and I'm selecting this because they're currently experiencing the Willow Creek fire, which is approaching about 4,000 acres, 0% contained, and is being increasingly driven by warm, dry, windy conditions. So looking at Monterey County, it immediately opens up to a tab that displays the number or the proportion of the community and risks to homes, the proportion of homes within the community, that are exposed to wildfire risk. So this is illustrated in the top hand left corner, where you have a quick summary statement that indicates where that particular geography rests amidst comparison to either the state or the nation. So in this example, it says Monterey County is in the 35th percentile among counties in California. We all know risk is relative, however. So I'll talk about that in more detail here momentarily, but below it is a scatter plot that indicates, again, where it is visually relative to other counties in the state in terms of the number of risk to home, or the number of homes at risk. You'll also notice right next to it, however, is a toggle option in which you can shift that geography of comparison from the state to the nation if you choose. Notice what happens when we do that. It immediately increases its risk display because we know that California, relative to the risk across the country, is much, much higher. So in this situation, Monterey County actually is in the upper 80th percentile in terms of its risk to homes. Similarly, this is indicated by the scatter plot below. So that's an important feature of this. Working, as I said, the scatter plot there. Working further, what's also great about this is that you can zoom into the community level, not the neighborhood or parcel level. We don't allow that due to granularity and the detail loss there, but you can zoom into a community scale. So if you do that, it will display at that 1 to 50,000 scale. I'll get into that here in a moment. The top right-hand corner, you see a number of other options: a risk to homes, an exposure type, a wildfire likelihood, and a vulnerable populations tab. And I'll go through those really quickly as we move on. So this is the zooming feature. If you do that, you can go into the community scale, as I said. Again, this is relative to the state of California at this time. Here is this exposure type. So exposure, this means the community's exposure to both direct and indirect wildfire exposure. So by indirect, we're talking about embers or home-to-home ignition. And by direct, we're talking about direct flame contact. This is an important distinguishing feature of this website because many places that traditionally consider themselves safe from wildfires are actually indirectly exposed by ember cast or by home-to-home ignition. So this is for the town and community of Salinas. As I said, in the upper left-hand corner, you also have this feature where you can toggle between showing the fully geography with all the lands, or you can toggle it back to showing just the populated area so you can see where most of the homes and people are living. So if you toggle that on, you can see again the concentration of where most of those populated areas are within your geography. Moving on to the next one, wildfire likelihood. So this is the probability that a wildfire will occur. Similar to the other tabs, we have a summary statement in the left-hand corner, followed by a scatter or bubble plot that shows where that geography risks in comparison to the state or to the nation. Very important of this website, and for probably many in this audience, is in the top right-hand corner, there is a download option in which you can go to a U.S. Forest Service archive, collect all the shapefiles for this data, as well as tabular information in the form of Excel spreadsheets. And you can do that for the community, county, or the state. So that's a very important feature. Lastly, the vulnerable populations tab, and what we've done with this is that the census tract, we have pulled, and for the community rather, we have pulled 6 socioeconomic demographics, and this is in an effort to help shed light on what are the variables within that county that might need to be considered when you're talking about evacuation, protocols, planning, mitigation efforts, because we all know that wildfires do not affect everyone equally, and that there are certain factors such as age, access to mobility, and other things that might come into play in consideration when you're talking about all the factors that are considered for the planning, the prevention, the mitigation, the recovery, and the rebuilding process. So this is wildfire risk to communities. Also part of this, and as a close sister tool of it, housed within the Headwaters Economics website, is an option to actually report or download reports on this. So if you go to our website, you can access this tool. Monterey, California, or County, California is already customed into the search index. And what you get out of it is a report in both an Excel spreadsheet, so you can copy and paste, as well as a downloadable PDF. And this contains all those wildfire risk data layers that were in the tool itself. So including risk to homes, exposure, susceptibility, and then a variety of socioeconomic demographics, such as housing characteristics, poverty levels, vulnerable populations, and other things that might shed light on the types of landowners, home ownership, and wildfire risk within certain geographies. Similarly, this is not explicit to wildfire, but I think is a really good tool to use for this audience as neighborhoods at risk. This is built in a very similar fashion to wildfire risk to communities. Again, it allows you to search by both community or county. And if you go to it, you can enter any geography of your choosing. And here in the upper left-hand corner, we have a basic breakdown of the socioeconomic variables within that geography. The lower left-hand corner are some climate factors to consider. The right-hand corner, you have the option to download, again, a report in both an Excel or PDF file. And then very importantly, in the top right corner, we have a climate projections option that if you select that, it can take you to another page where you get a heat index by both days and annual temperature increase, as well as precipitation trends. And this was done in partnership with a variety of partners that are all listed at the bottom, including NOAA, Climate Resilience Fund, and the Academy of Sciences. So this is where this can be found, neighborhoods at risk. I think with that, my time is up, but this is my contact information, and I'm more than happy to field any questions either here or after this presentation. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Super, thanks, Kimmy. Great, super interesting. I'm actually up next. I'm having some trouble sharing my screen as well. Sorry, it doesn't seem to want to. Oh my gosh. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and skip over to Christian Huggel. Christian, if you don't mind going next while I figure out what's going on with my computer, it wants me to change some settings. I don't want everyone to sit here and wait. Are you available to begin your presentation? We'll just go a little bit out of order.
Sure, Lisa. Sure, I'm skipping just a second. I think I shouldn't have any problem to share.
Thank you. I'll fix mine and I'll go after you.
Can you see that? Okay, I guess so. Great. So welcome to this presentation on unmanaged managed retreat in mountain regions facing climate-related risks. I also acknowledge my co-authors who are listed here below. And just one word about terminology. This is, I'm labeling here managed retreat. However, I'm talking also quite a bit about the relocation, which is probably more a process, but I think there's also some issues about the terminology we might find along the way. So why focusing on mountains? Mountains are not really at the forefront of discussions of retreat. However, mountains are at the forefront of climate change. And mountains are very much affected by climate change, especially those mountain areas that are, and there are many, that are connected to and affected by cryosphere changes, these glaciers now in permafrost. And just to show you here, this graphic shows in what terms of layers we have to think. So we start at climate change, then go to the glacier mass loss, permafrost thaw, and seasonal snow reduction or permanent. And then we have the biophysical impacts, which are a number, for instance, landslide hazards, but also ecosystem change, water resources change. And then we have the social economic impacts. And this is actually where retreat and relocation happens. And of course, you see that on the right side, this is more adaptation wise. And there's a number of social, economic, political factors that of course are also very relevant for retreat and relocation processes and decisions. So go for the next one. The discussion about retreat in mountains and relocation has also been fueled by recent events, such as, for instance, the disaster, flood, avalanche and flood disaster in Chamoli in Uttarakhand, India. This was just published 1 week before the retreat special issue in Science. So it's a big event, big avalanche debris flow affecting valleys in the Himalayas in India. You see the pictures how quite large hydropower projects have been affected. So basically the question here that came much quite a bit, do we actually need to retreat from these areas that are becoming more and more risky due to instabilities in the How Mountains? However, this has also, and this is very interesting, here in this case, it's also been in conflict to targets such as with an increase of renewable, such as here seen in hydropower production. Now, I've done a literature search. The literature is actually not so broad and numerous in terms of what we know about retreat and relocation in mountains. It's rather scarce, and it's more based on anecdotal evidence. However, we have been able to basically extract 3 main types and causes of relocation. And these are water availability, natural hazards, and infrastructure development, including especially hydropower projects. And I will just show you a couple examples for those 3 dimensions now. First, the water availability. There's a quite a well-known example from Nepal, from the Upper Mustang regions, and that has happened in the recent past, in the 2010s, over several years. Fact is, there is a declining water supply in these regions. It's a dry region in the Upper Mustang Valley basin, so declining water supply from reduction of snow cover and precipitation, so climate change relation. There's an autonomous planning and collective decision was in place on relocation by the communities, which were 3 affected villages. Other adaptation measures, such as, for instance, other crops that are more fit for low water demanding, or also very widespread seasonal labor migration, were found to be no longer feasible. So these 3 villages have relocated further downstream. In terms of natural hazards, we have here this is from Switzerland. I'm based at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. So this is a case from the central Swiss Alps, where due to warming, permafrost, perennially frozen rock has been thawing and producing rock falls that then evolved into very large debris flows and floods that were totally unprecedented in this region with a very high intensity and a very high frequency also. You see here pictures, and if you go to the, just need to see whether I can, with the laser pointer, 1 second. You can see here one of the houses and infrastructure had to be basically pulled down here. You can see in this picture. So those people and farm business had to be relocated and compensated by insurance schemes. There's also discussion about relocating a whole settlement that were a number of family and houses where so there's a planning at the community level and also with higher order administrative agencies, and insurance was very important. Interesting there was of course resistance of the local population. That's not surprising against this relocation. And even in the household, in the same household, there are sometimes differences. For instance, a wife said, I actually want to go from this place. This is too dangerous. I feel too dangerous. And the husband said, no, I'm grown up here and I really don't want to leave this place, whatever happens. This is also, I have found things, for instance, working in Colombia in a totally different context, that people in the same community have very different perceptions and thus also decisions. Another case about natural hazards is going back to the 50s, but this was important in Switzerland. It's discussions about 1951 was a big snow avalanche disaster year in the Alps in Europe, and there were a lot of discussions about this sort of relocation. And this particular community here was so exposed that they said basically either we make a very strong investment of tens of millions of dollars, or we relocate. And interestingly, this was really a national discourse about engagement or abandonment of alpine community, and sort of triggered this conception about self-conception of Swiss population as mountain people. Yes, we have to stay there. We basically resist the nature. And so the decision was to invest heavily in snow avalanche protection. Another case, and this is now the third sort of dimension, this is about infrastructure development, hydropower, and this is maybe you've heard about it or seen pictures, emblematic case of Relocation. This is a region, it's in Italy, Südtirol, which is German-speaking, and it's right at the border region between Austria, Italy, and Switzerland. This was in the 50s, that was a forced relocation. A forced relocation, it actually goes back to the 30s in the fascist area of Italy. There was virtually no community involvement, 150 families affected, minimal compensation, and sort of the grief and all the losses, especially on a mental level, go actually remain into the present. And this drowned church tower in the lake and the reservoir lake are still up to date, a sign of what had happened at that point. A short reflection and conclusions on that. So we mainly have case-based experiences, and we have been able to sort out these three dimensions. We have found that relocation amounts involves different drivers, perception, decision processes as compared to migration. So I mean, this is important. It's maybe basic, but it's important. It's really not the same. It's usually you have migration for individuals, whereas relocation retreat is community level. And also some discrimination aspects may not apply. For instance, that low vulnerability, people with lower vulnerability would have are more able to migrate. This cannot be transferred to retreat and relocations. The relocation discussions are held and decisions are taken, that's very important, in respective environmental, socio-political discourses of the time. This is especially for what we have seen in the 1950s, can be very felt. And I think this is also important take-home messages for the future. We have to see what is this context. In the mountains, these courses in mountains are very strong. So abandonment, withstanding, resisting nature's forces, self-conception, national identity, the myths, romanticism, landscape tourism. And then also planned, unplanned, managed, unmanaged, autonomous retreat and relocation category depends very much on socioeconomic political context. And relocation and retreat discussion decision typically reach beyond cost-benefit consideration. Maybe this is also trivial, but just important to remind, and it's not just monetary cost-benefit, but also other cost-benefit which we might be looking at. And just my final slide. I mean, the whole discussion we are currently having very much in the IPCC for the upcoming 6th assessment report. So what does it mean really going then beyond limits of adaptation? Do retreat and relocation come into play once limits to adaptation are reached? And where actually are these thresholds? How are they defined? On the left side, we see the concept of acceptable, tolerable, and intolerable risks. So one of the conception is that we say, okay, relocation and retreat is when it comes to intolerable risk space. More recently, we have developed a scheme for existential risks. So looking is relocated related to existential dimensions of risk, and we have separated different categories: well-being, basic needs, and physical survival. And I think it will be interesting and fruitful to relate retreat and relocations to the levels of these existential factors, and when actually are we deciding on retreat? Is it just about physical survival, basic needs, or already when we are talking about well-being? This is what I wanted to tell you in short. Thanks very much for listening, and glad to have later time for some questions.
Great, thank you, Christian, and thanks for being willing to step in. Here we go, mine should be working now. Okay, terrific. Okay. My talk was really ideally situated right after Kimmy's, and we had even coordinated a little bit, so she was sort of teeing it up. So we're a little bit out of order, but I think it will still be okay. So I begin this presentation by asking this key question: is wildfire in the American West a reasonable case for thinking about managed retreat? And not to spoil this, but the answer is no. I think for a lot of reasons, the answer is categorically no, that managed retreat is not going to save us from our wildfire challenge. And the main reason for that has to do with scale. And I think Kimmy did a really excellent job of setting us up to understand the scale, the nature of the scale. This is a graphic that shows each of these miniature little dots represents a county where more than 50,000 residents are in a high-risk wildland urban interface zone. Just to give you some sense of how large this is, the challenge in the American West is particularly noteworthy because of the complex ownership patterns across the West. More than 30% of the landscape across the West is federally managed. We have a wildland urban interface that's rapidly growing. Part of that is these so-called amenity-seeking migrants, and I imagine that is we are going to be seeing an increase in the rate of relocation as COVID experiences have taught us how many jobs are now portable. Meaning people would rather live backing up to some beautiful open space than in a high-rise apartment if they can take their job with them. But it creates all sorts of ownership boundary challenges for management. Another reason we can't identify, we can't use managed retreat as the solution to the wildfire challenge is we are continually and still beset by data limitations and the complexities of assessing risk. It's quite difficult, as I think Kimmy's presentation helped to illustrate, the risk to an individual household, to an individual parcel. Some of the most damaging fires in recent years have been more the result of embers and flame length from nearby areas than from fire risk on site. So that adds a whole other layer of complexity to accurately assessing whether me in my house, in my mountain town, is at such high risk that I should actually evacuate before a fire begins, the scale of that and the complexities of accurately assessing risk make it pretty unworkable. And we also don't know where all these people would go, right? We've got many millions of people who might be considered in these high-risk zones, as evidenced by this map. There's a great scene in the movie Rebuilding Paradise, if any of you have seen that movie about the Paradise Fire a couple of years ago. And there's a scene in that movie where somebody in the town council is saying sort of scornfully, well, why were those people living there? You know, they shouldn't have been living in such a high risk zone. And the lawyer who represents the town says, where would you have them go? Into earthquake zones in California, into flood zones on the coast, right? So we're dealing with these multiple compound, cascading, and interconnected risks across the geographical landscape that make it really difficult to imagine uprooting millions of people and moving them into some imaginary safe zone. So I feel fairly strongly that managed retreat is not a good fit for the wildfire problem. And I will continue to make that case by zooming in a little more carefully on the case of Colorado. Here's some data coming from a couple of different sources, so the numbers don't add up perfectly, but just to give you a sense of the scale, we have just about 3 million residents in the wildland urban interface, which has increased by 50% just in the last 5 years. This data comes from 2017. That increased is 50% from 2012. 40% of the state population lives in these risk zones. So basically you live in an urban core, or every other area is considered a high risk zone. There's almost 1 million houses that we'd have to consider. A good portion of those are seasonal or second homes, which also adds to the complexity. So again, this is a scale beyond the reach of managed retreat. Here's a snapshot of Colorado. This is the Colorado State Forest Service wildfire risk portal, does some cool things like the ones that Kimmy showed us as well. This is an estimate of risk. It's a composite risk index that takes into account values at risk and burn probability. And it shows, of course, the front range. This area right here in the middle of the screen is where all the big cities are in Colorado. And then this is where some of the highest risk from geography and terrain exists. And this is where fire has actually occurred across Colorado historically, both on federal lands and non-federal lands. So you can see we have across the landscape, lots of fire, lots of risk. Here's another look at historical fire ignitions from 1992 to 2017, fires happening all over the place in this state, making it really difficult to meaningfully predict and identify which areas should be the target of managed retreat. And remember, just as a reminder, one key way that wildfire is different from floods as a case study for managed retreat is that many flooded areas flood repeatedly. The same home will be flooded out year after year after year. That's quite unlikely and in many cases even impossible in a wildfire setting, because once the fire comes through, all of the flammable material is gone. It looks like a moonscape. It's not going to burn again next year. It might burn again in 20 or 30 or 40 years, but we don't have the same pattern of recurring wildfires occurring on the same home. It just doesn't make any sense. So that's an additional reason why managed retreat is difficult. Here's a summary of some of the most recent data from just last summer in Colorado. They had a pretty bad fire year, over 1,000 fires that occurred. It breaks them down here by source of ignition and a total of 625,000 acres that were burned. So again, scale, scale, scale. So if managed retreat is not the option, what are the options? What can we do to reduce wildfire risk? And the answer to that is we adapt in place. In the context of the challenges of these land ownership patterns, my research has focused on how can we understand roles for different actors in this setting? Who is in charge of which components of adaptation and who pays for it? This kind of work, creating defensible space around the home, is the primary tool that is offered for non-federal landowners, right? If you live in a wildland urban interface zone that's high risk, risk. These are the types of activities that are recommended to reduce, but not eliminate, your risk. But who pays for it, and how do we reduce these fuels? We really have two tools. We can reduce fuels mechanically and through prescribed burn. I'm going to talk about those really quickly just to set the stage. But a reminder that all of these kinds of actions really require collective action. If I live in this house and take all of these aggressive actions around my home to reduce risk, but my neighbors do not, a fire can still get a lot of traction in my neighborhood and I'm much less protected. So again, we've got two basic tools to reduce fuels. One is mechanical treatments. This is just cutting down trees. You can see it looks like this. On federal lands, they talk about acres treated, and it's considered a performance incentive for fire managers and foresters. It's extremely expensive. You can see all of these people in this image. They each are being paid. That equipment is being leased, and they have to drive that material somewhere. Across the West, we have very weak timber markets. The material coming out of these forests is worth very little. So it's really done by a service contract, not as a revenue generating contract with the Forest Service. We don't have agreement about which silvicultural approaches to reducing fuels are the most effective. And we don't know how to approach something like this on non-federal lands. This is the case where a homeowner has to hire people to come out. They have to rent equipment depending on the size of their property. So mechanical treatments is still a primary tool that is used, but it's quite limited. And we don't have a solid conclusion about how effective this is in the face of a catastrophic wildfire at reducing risk. Prescribed fire is much better, provides ecological benefits that only fire can provide, and has been shown categorically to reduce risk of future fires. It is much less expensive. Here's one guy with a drip torch as opposed to a whole staff. There's certainly other people working with this guy on his team, and they're monitoring and patrolling the boundary. But prescribed fire is really limited in its application. It's not always possible for air quality reasons, for permitting reasons, for safety reasons, for weather reasons and conditions. Risk of escape is always present. And the public has a really hard time understanding that the best way to protect them from wildfire is through the use of fire. So this is a hard sell. Instead, what we recommend is this process of adaptive governance. And we talk about adaptive governance as something that we use in the face of scientific uncertainty in a setting of complex social and ecological systems that are interwoven. We know some best practices of adaptive governance as a tool. The process matters. People involved should co-produce knowledge. It shouldn't be a top-down imposition of knowledge. You have to be attentive to matching of scale, who's working on this and where the work will be done. Those should match. And they should be up for constant revision and monitoring and improvement. Here's the way the IPCC envisions adaptive governance. I'm going to show you another image of adaptive governance. I'm sort of rushing through these because I want to get to my quick case study before I run out of time. But there are lots of ways to think about how these pieces fit together. So we took this idea, my co-author Tony Chang at Colorado State University and I studied the Colorado Wildfire Risk Reduction Grant Program and asked some questions about whether it succeeds as an adaptive governance mechanism. The program was intended to reach specifically and only non-federal lands through a matching funds competitive grant program. Only groups of homeowners were eligible, not individuals. That's again a reminder about the collective action nature of this problem. And it was really intended to build capacity among these neighborhoods and communities to address their fire risk into the future. An advisory committee was created with diverse actors from all different sectors of the fire world, and an aggressive and robust monitoring program was part of this program. We asked a few questions. Does the Wildfire Risk Reduction Grant Program succeed as an adaptive governance mechanism? Is it working in that in that way? And does this type of state-run competitive grant program deserve more attention? There's very few of these. This is really an unusual program, and that's why we decided to study it. And then, of course, and perhaps this is a different presentation, but did it succeed? Did it succeed in reducing risk when all was said and done? Here's what we found when we reviewed 6 years worth of grant information and allocation of funding. It was highly competitive. We had many more applications than funds that were awarded, and the awards that were handed out were asymmetrical. In other words, larger organizations got more money, and smaller, struggling communities had a much harder time attracting funding. These awards were shown to reduce crown fire potential successfully, but surface fuels were unaffected. We found many of the awardees cut down trees and then left piles of slash on their property. So they just moved biomass around, potentially not even addressing flammability. And this program came up against some political restructuring problems as it was moved from one agency to another and defunded for a number of years. That really limited its reach. So was this a successful approach? We're not sure. It also occurred during a moratorium in the state on prescribed fire. So none of the awardees were allowed to use prescribed fire, meaning all of these projects were done with mechanical fuels reduction. Here's my final slide. The implications of this case study is that mechanical fuels reduction is quite limited. It's expensive, it has only short-term impacts, and over the long term doesn't seem to do much for us. Prescribed burning is much better, but for many good reasons, we have our hands tied in larger application. Collective action and social learning are essential to any success in wildfire risk reduction. But in this example, and we suspect in many others, political and economic issues can interfere with good execution. And this was one of our most important findings, is that the most high capacity, well-equipped communities were the ones that were able to mount the most competitive applications and receive funding. They were able to come up with matching funds. So having capacity lets you build more capacity. Scale was a very tricky issue here. So yes, we think this grant program offers a compelling model, but within some limitations. This is a photo of that a friend took on the street in Colorado last summer. So that's just an idea of what wildfire life feels like across the West. Okay, I feel like I rushed through that. Thanks for your attention. And next up, we have Diane Moss with Foos and O'Neill.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Thank you very much. Glad to be here today, talking about a project that incorporated retreat as part of a hybrid design approach to reducing riverine flooding in an urban watershed. This was work done with my colleague Dean Adet at Foos and O'Neill. And I'm really going to take the scale down now in terms of the sort of scale of projects that we've been talking about this morning. Being mindful of the time, what I'm going to do is provide an overview of the flooding issues in this watershed, which we fully expect to be exacerbated by a changing climate. I'm going to describe the proposed flood mitigation plan that we worked out, and then touch upon the benefits, financial and otherwise, of using this hybrid approach. So just to sort of place us where we are, this project is in Rhode Island here in the northeastern United States. Specifically, it involves two communities, Johnson, the town of Johnson, and Cranston, Rhode Island. You can see some statistics here on those two communities, just over 100,000 people total, a limited minority and low-income populations. There are, in the watershed that we're focused on, also some populations that are linguistically isolated, and in particular, some elderly populations. Just to give you a sense of the watershed, you can see it here, as well as the breakdown of the land use. It's about a 20 square mile watershed with about 1.5 square miles of floodplain. So quite a bit of floodplain. And along that floodplain corridor especially is where we see residential and commercial and industrial development. Also, particularly it's more, even though it's almost a third forested, that forested area tends to be to the west, further away from the river corridor. And also our environmental justice populations tend to be in the southern part of the watershed, away from those forested areas as well. So this is a highly urbanized area overall. We see flooding here during all three, the 10, 25, and 100-year rainstorm events. The damages that we're seeing include loss of property values, property damage to both commercial and residential properties, as well as increased costs to the local governments here due to repairs that are required for the impacted roads and the bridges. On average, the annual damages are upwards of $3 million. That's on an annual basis. Just over 300 residential properties that consist of both houses and apartment units are subject to this flooding. In addition, there are impacts associated with emergency vehicle access, which of course creates health and safety impacts for those members of the community, and in particular for sort of climate vulnerable members of the community. In addition, potential for impacts to surface and groundwater resources, so potable water resources in this area as a result of flooded septic or on-site wastewater disposal systems, as well as sewer systems in the watershed. So this study focused on looking at high hazard areas, high hazard flooding areas, which are determined based on the depth and velocity of flow, depth that's greater than 3 feet, velocity of floodwater that's greater than 5 feet per second, so pretty swiftly moving water. And it really focused in on some discrete areas that you can both see on the map, but also see listed in these two communities. And I'm going to quickly, being mindful of the time, walk you through what that flooding looks like, more to give you a sense and feel of what that feels like and looks like. We can see here, I'm just going to focus in on a couple areas within this watershed, but this is the Rotary Drive area. We have 19 residential homes that are impacted by flooding. This gives you a sense of what that looks like from a 2005 event. South Bennett Drive, 32 residential properties in this area, as well as an apartment complex that is affordable housing units. In particular, the lower units in that apartment complex experience severe flooding, and emergency access is really curtailed, kind of leaving these folks isolated during flooding events. This is Fletcher Ave, which has a mix of industrial, commercial, and residential properties. So here we have both temporary loss of housing, property damage, loss of business income, loss of wages, and also loss of development potential for areas here. In addition to residential properties, there's roughly 32 commercial industrial properties. So really a mix here that we see. This is just to give you another image of the depth, and I think you can almost get a feel of the movement here of the water in this Fletcher Ave area on the back of these houses. So the project goals were to reduce flood damages to properties, to reduce damage to roads and bridges, to reduce the local government costs that were recurring costs due to infrastructure repair, reduce disruption to the local economy. And the goal was to provide a 97% damage reduction from the 100-year recurrence event, or the 1% chance flood event. And I'll give the caveat that that's under current mapped conditions. And I think this, earlier Christian mentioned how, does retreat and relocation become something that becomes considered more so as you reach the limits of your adaptation? And I think that was the question that these communities were getting to. Have they, how do we balance adaptation against relocation? So the options evaluated really went along a scale of what I'll call, nature-based or green solutions to more gray or hardened infrastructure solutions. And that ranged from buyouts and relocation of affected properties, recreation of the, opening up of the floodway again, wetland restoration, dam rehabilitation or removal, just making changes in the channel to provide more capacity, removing constraints, to then moving into, oftentimes what we see is more traditional flood control or hardened infrastructure flood control, elevating structures, dry flood proofing, putting in berms or dikes, putting in flood walls. And that's something that, really that whole range of options was evaluated here. The mitigation plan, the proposed flood mitigation plan, is a project that's funded under the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service PL 566 project funding mechanism. And that pays for 100% of the eligible flood protection improvements. And then the partners in that process, in this case, the municipalities, take over the operation and maintenance of those improvements. I mentioned the goal for resilience. And then, this watershed plan was completed in 2020. It incorporates this hybrid approach. And we were really looking to maximize the use of, natural systems to also bring co-benefits to the community. The funding for this is secured and it's waiting for final federal approval. So looking forward to seeing it moving forward. So now to show you what that looks like. So the preferred alternative, it was a mix. There was acquisition of approximately 140 properties that were within that 100-year floodplain. Again, as currently mapped, the 100-year floodplain, and demolition of those structures. So to sort of, reopen, if you will, that floodplain area. So in total, 134 structures. Also dry proofing of some structures sort of on the edge of that floodplain area. There was a bypass culvert that was installed at one tributary stream, removal of some of a debris dam on the river itself. And there was also the installation of sheet pile flood walls along 2 sections, and then associated drainage infrastructure improvements to go with that. Overall, this results in a net restoration of about 38.5 acres of floodplain. This gives you a visual sense of, what that looks like along sort of the length of the watershed. And just to sort of orient you to the color coding here, green circles indicate a buyout or a relocation and acquisition of property. The red is a flood wall or pump station. Also the Simmonsbrook culvert is there shown in red. Orange is floodproofing, and then I mentioned we see the culvert symbol here. In a few cases, there are still some to be determined areas, but those are relatively minimal. You can see mapped here also in a lighter blue, the extent of existing 100-year FEMA floodplain. And then this just sort of zooms in. We're going to take a look at the Rotary Drive area where we're looking, again, remember this house, and what we're looking to do here is acquire those homes shown in green and flood-proof those ones shown in yellow. So this is a chance to sort of take back that floodplain area or make that floodplain area available again for flooding without creating damage to homes and structures. This is another area where you can see again on River Drive or River Ave rather, a mix of both floodproofing as well as some areas of actual acquisition of structures to be able to, get that floodplain area accessible again. And then we're going to sort of continue to move downstream. We have the Fletcher Avenue site. Again, this is the mix of industrial, commercial, and residential properties. And we see a large area, including industrial properties, that are part of these structures that are going to be purchased and relocated. Looking again at the Riverview Terrace area, we can see some more areas of relocation. And then I do want to point out that in one, particularly in this area here, the Willowbrook Apartments, this was a large apartment complex. The decision was made here to instead install a flood wall that you can see here shown in that sort of magenta purple color. That was sort of the most feasible, cost effective in that area, and less disruptive as well to the folks in that particular community there. I want to mention what we see as the value of taking this hybrid approach. Oftentimes there's sort of this feeling of is it all or nothing in some of these areas, and I think what we see here is that there's this ability to kind of move along that continuum. So one of the features that had an appeal for these communities was that we were actually creating some open space areas in what are very built out neighborhoods. So new open space areas that could be managed by, in partnership with local watershed associations to also allow public access to the river. So to make the river corridor an amenity as opposed to a hazard or being sort of viewed that way. Also provides an opportunity to improve riparian buffer and habitat. I mentioned, 38 or so acres of floodplain being restored as a result. Overall, also this minimizes infrastructure that's required to be operated and maintained. The flood walls come with sort of some pumping and drainage infrastructure. So overall, it saves both on capital and operation and maintenance costs. You can see that here just in different neighborhoods that we talked about. The cost of the sort of what we'll call nature-based or solutions versus, a flood wall cost. Looking at those individual segments, you can see that in each case, the preferred approach, which is shown in blue here, in most, in all of the communities except for the Willowbrook apartments area where there is a flood wall, using those nature-based solutions really lowers costs. And I'll wrap up here because I'm mindful of time. So final thoughts, this combination of retreat, nature-based solutions and hardened infrastructure, this points to the need for that sort of hybrid approach. And now, we're very excited and encouraged by the fact that nature-based solutions are something that FEMA is looking at as a pre-disaster hazard mitigation measure through their BRIC program, which we think will encourage this sort of work going forward. Long-term, this is cost-effective. The green and nature-based elements can lower both initial costs and long-term ones. Retreat from the floodplain was something that both NRCS and the community saw as necessary for protection of life and property and overall public safety. Just a mention on how relocation will be done following federal guidelines. And I'd like to just mention that there's a precedent in Cranston. They've been buying houses, they've been acquiring houses in the floodplain. The municipality has since 2010. And in general, the observation is that the demand is greater than the funding that they have available to acquire properties. So it's clear here that the community, by and large, understands the problems, has a willingness to relocate, and this allows us to create some more innovative sort of hybrid solutions to approach these problems. And with that, I will thank you. My contact information is here, and Lisa, I'll turn it back to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Diane. Super interesting. Up next, we have Teun Terpstra.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to share my screen. See if it works. Can you see my presentation now or not?
We can, but we can also see all your notes and stuff. So you might want to play the presentation, start the slideshow. You can click slideshow up top. Yeah.
Yep.
No, we can still see all your notes. We're still seeing your notes.
Oh, that's strange because I have a double screen. So apparently it's taking the wrong screen, but that's difficult to move around. Does this work better? Is it now bigger?
Sure. We can still see them, but we'll ignore them. We can see the main pictures. No problem. Okay,
sorry for that. Sometimes yeah, with Zoom or other like Teams, it works in a different way. So normally I work with Teams, so I didn't exactly know how it would work. But if you can see it, that's the most important. So thanks a lot. My name is Teun Terpstra. I'm from the HZ University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. And we'll present here today with a couple of co-authors the work in progress on a literature review with regard to social resistance and acceptance of planned dike relocations, also known as managed realignment in Europe, or depolarization as they sometimes call it in the Netherlands or in France. So what you see here on the background is the city of Vlissingen, which is at the mouth of the Western Scheldt estuary in the Netherlands. And our university is based in this nice city, and you can see also the coastline. As you may know, the Netherlands is exposed to flooding. Almost a quarter of our country is located below sea level, and 2/3 of the country is exposed to flood risk if you count in also river risk flooding. So sea level rise and global warming poses a major threat also to our country. Here you can see our study area, which is the Headwaters, shown by the blue marker. That is, the Headwaters is located at the end of the Western Scheldt estuary. The Western Scheldt is used heavily by large vessels, container vessels that go to the harbor of Antwerp in the eastern part, which is one of the major European ports. The Western Scheldt is also heavily protected by nature law. All the soils behind the dikes are very fertile agricultural soils. So nature, flood protection, and agriculture always have to find a balance. And one of the major points for this research is the Headwaters, which is going to be realigned because the channel to the harbor of Antwerp had to be deepened. And if you do anything that reduces the area of nature, then you need to compensate. So the Headwaters is basically going to be the compensation for the reduction of nature due to the deepening and the widening of the shipping channel. And there's so little space in this estuary that for everything that you do, you need to find compensation, but actually there's no space. So this will be a major issue also for the future. And here you can see the Headwaters a little bit closer, and it's only 3 square kilometers. So it's very small area, but it is already for years a topic for major social conflict in the province of Zeeland. What often happens when changes are occurring in landscapes is that people that are living there oppose against it for many reasons, of course. And this was also the case for Headwaters. So here you can see that actually the decision to depolder the Headwaters was already taken in 2005, and a treaty was signed between Belgian and Dutch government. But due to local opposition, all kinds of committees that had a say, political debate, lawsuits, the final decision was taken in 2018 by the Supreme Court, and currently the construction works are going to start. And on the top right, you see one of the many pictures that are available on the internet of the local opposition around this area. And in the right corner, lower corner, you can see the Headwaters as it will look like in the near future on the left side. So our research university is involved in a number of research projects, and we will study for the next 3 years how the general public perceives the depoldering process. So basically their support or opposition against the depoldering. Therefore, we have started a systematic literature review to gain better insight into the drivers and barriers of such local support or opposition for these kinds of projects. And next to the Headwaters, there is 2 other areas shown here in the background that have also undergone depoldering in the past, but these were not occupied areas. So these are, these cause less conflict in the area, but still it's interesting to compare them with the Headwaters. So for the literature review, we especially are interested in the concept of place attachment. So place attachment is the bonding that occurs between individuals and their meaningful environments. And it's a multidimensional concept. There's a number of papers that have looked into these different kinds of dimensions and formed theoretical frameworks about them. But to keep it more practical, you can think of feelings like homesickness or going to pilgrimage that are all have to do with place attachment. In the Netherlands now, with the energy transformation towards all electric, windmills are placed also in farmland areas, and there is also a lot of opposition against these kinds of windmills because they change the identity of the landscape. And often when people have lived for a long time somewhere, the identity of the landscape is becoming part of your own identity, and you start to become emotionally attached and depending on the landscape as you have always known it. And that's why place attachment is an important construct. So our literature review, we used a search key and entered that into the EBSCO host database where we had access to. And then we used snowballing on the internet, amongst others through Google Scholar, to find related papers. So the search key centered around the concept of place attachment shown on the first row, and on the second row with the end statement, everything related to river and coastal management, basically, and managed realignment and depolering. Until now, we found first more than 200 papers from EBSCO host database. We assembled a review team with 4 people, each working in groups of 2, and reviewing abstracts and titles, and then selecting and deselecting papers. And that ended up in 37 papers being selected. And through snowballing, we added 5 more. So we came to a total of 42 papers. We are currently in the process of organizing everything, and we are aiming to publish this research in a paper. It shows that most of the papers apply to Europe. Maybe that is due to the fact that managed realignment and depolering is especially a policy in Europe, and maybe in the US it's more mentioned under the name retreat. It would be interesting to hear your suggestions about that. So the most papers are from Europe and a few from other continents. It shows that the number of publications is stably increasing, and it seems that since, let's say, between 2005 and 10, there has been a small acceleration in the number of papers on this topic. On the right-hand side, you can see the thematic areas as they were indexed by the EBSCO host or the journals. And of course, environmental sciences is on the top. But what I found interesting is that social sciences, and especially psychology, is hardly represented. Place attachment is actually an environmental psychological concept. So that is quite remarkable in that sense. So we classified our papers in 4 thematic classes: managed realignment papers, coastal management, river management, and methodological papers. And here you can see the distribution. So 13 for managed realignment, total 9 for coastal management, 12 for river management, and a few methodological and combined papers. The papers comprise about 27,000 respondents divided mostly quantitative papers, so mostly surveys, mail surveys, online surveys, and also some face-to-face and group interviews. And the category other reflects, for instance, social media posts. So there were some studies that used different kind of ways of collecting data. We categorized or classified all the concepts and variables that were measured in these studies. So place attachment is part of the category landscape perception, which was measured in quite a number of studies. Also risk perception and of course acceptance were measured in quite a number of studies. But what was striking is that social norms have not been measured in many of these studies. And we know from behavioral science that especially social norms are very important for people's behavior. So that seems to be, a gap at least. So the managed realignment studies, this is just to give you an overview. And in the middle, you can see the countries. So the UK is represented in many of these studies. Many were mail questionnaires. And here you can see the number of respondents. In Germany, a number of studies were done using face-to-face interviews. What was also interesting to see here is that these studies focused on things like trust and perceived risk, worry, knowledge, proximity to the flood defenses, and the age of respondents. But the concept of place attachment was not used as a theoretical framework in any of these studies. A few studies refer to place attachment as a concept, but more in the discussion or in the introduction, but not empirical insights. So as one of these studies mentioned, there is a need for application of behavioral theories and more systematic insights. That means that we also need different kinds of statistical analysis, so not only descriptive, but also correlational and controlling, for instance, for demographical variables to see what effects are of place attachment, for instance. So the coastal management studies, here you can see that the concept of place attachments is better represented. So a number of studies used place attachment. Heimat is a German word for a similar concept. Sense of place by Newell and Canessa is also a similar concept. So here it seems to be better embedded in the literature. What else was there? Well, I think in these studies where place attachment was used as a concept, the authors really looked into the different dimensions of place attachment. So they really tried to validate what these concepts were about and which factors played a role and correlated with other variables. So that was interesting to see. Especially in river management studies, place attachment was embedded quite often. Here it shows that many of these studies are actually from the Netherlands, which I didn't know before. But apparently we have had a 20-year program called Room for the River in the Netherlands, making space for rivers. And there has been a community of researchers looking into place attachment in the river area in the Netherlands, and quite a number of publications have come out of that. What is interesting is that it turns out that in these studies, place attachment is correlated to resistance or support for these river management programs, so the interventions that were taken. So place attachment turned out, and different dimensions of place attachment turned out to be of value for explaining the support or opposition that people have in river management policies. So to conclude, managed realignment studies, especially in Europe, mostly in the UK, some insights into socio-psychological concepts like trust and risk perception, but especially a lack of theoretical frameworks from the social sciences, and place attachment is not used. Place attachment is more used in coastal management studies, and there is a larger diversity of countries represented in the database. And especially in river management studies, place attachment seems to be empirically validated, and it shows that there is a role for place attachment in explaining support and resistance towards river interventions. So I think these are all neighboring strands of literature, and it seems that they are currently somehow separated in the literature, and I think they can each learn from each other's approaches. So for our study, this means next steps. We will try to expand our literature review a bit more by checking also papers not only from EBSCOhost but also Web of Science and Scopus database to see if there are additional papers that we need to include. And we will develop, based on the literature review, and actually we are already working on that, a survey to measure place attachment and support for managed realignment in the Western Scheldt estuary and especially the Headwaters polder. Okay, thank you. That was my talk, and I hope you found it interesting, and maybe there will be some room for questions.
Teun, can you unshare your screen? We can.
Yeah, I will. Well, somehow I have trouble with my screens. That's probably also the reason why it went wrong in the beginning. Okay, here it works.
There we go.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
Thanks for an interesting talk. We unfortunately have only about 14 minutes left in the session. So Corey, it's all you, and I'm not sure we'll have much time at all for questions, but we look forward to this last talk.
We'll do my best to cruise here. So thanks a lot for having me. Great to be here. My talk is non-coastal in so far as it's concerned about the carbon budget, the atmosphere, and the emissions consequences of all this retreat, and also the sustainable energy transition that has to go along with it. So we're all very familiar that flooding events like this can give a lot of damage to the built environment and people's homes. And that will likely, although there's a lot of complexity around here that we're all discussing over these days, this will likely lead to some amount of retreat from the coastline. And we're going to need to rebuild those houses. Houses take energy and material to build. And in the current world that we live in, most of that energy comes from fossil fuels, so results in some CO2 emissions. In other places, we may need to enhance or build new coastal protections. And again, this takes material and energy. And some of those materials are highly emitting, like cement and steel, which together are around 10% of global emissions right now. So these will result in some emissions. Meanwhile, we want to prevent sea levels from rising more, which means we need to cap our CO2 emissions at some point, for instance, to keep warming to 2 degrees. And that means we need a lot of renewable energy capacity to come online. And that stuff looks like this: offshore wind, maybe some hydro, lots and lots of solar, lots of material goes into this. The material takes energy, the construction takes energy. And you can see that energy in this graph here, which is output from a energy system model that I'm using in this study. And it's showing primary energy demand being satisfied by different types of energy sources. So you can see historically on the side of the dotted line here, most of the energy is coming from fossil fuels. And then in the projected sustainable energy transition going into the future, you can see that those fossil fuels are displaced by renewables. Now, an interesting thing in this model is that they have this dotted line here which separates net energy available to society versus energy that's invested back into building energy capacity and maintaining it. You can see that early on in the transition, that energy investment back into energy is coming from fossil fuels, these purples. So that's going to result in emissions too that we really can't avoid. So the question arising from all this is how much CO2 will all this giant project of mitigation and adaptation emit? And the reason I think this is important is because if you think of climate change as kind of this march from pre-industrial 0 degrees C to hopefully our maximum of say 2 degrees, then if we've emitted so far so much CO2, then that leaves space available for our remaining carbon budget. And this is basically our runway to get our energy runway, one way to get to a sustainable energy future, and also to do the adaptation we need. And the question then is, how much of this budget is already taken up by mitigation and adaptation that we need to do? And I think we really don't have any idea how much that is. So that's the reason I want to do this project. I'm going to go very briefly through the methods here so we can hear some answers to some of the interesting questions. But basically the idea is to conceptualize emissions as the product of the amount of each intervention, so renewable energy, coastal protection, coastal retreat, times its emissions intensity. And in order to get all these things, these amounts and emissions intensities, we're going to use some sectoral models. I'm using two here. One is to represent the energy transition. This model is called NetSet. Here's the paper, and it produced this lovely, colorful output that I showed you before. And this basically gives us the amount of energy investment into energy, as well as the evolution of the energy mix. So basically the displacement of fossil fuels over time. And I'm using another model here, the coastal impacts and adaptation model, which is a cost optimization model to predict where the amount of coastal retreat versus protection versus lack of adaptation or adaptation in place. We have to complement this with a few other factors to round out the equations, but I won't get into too much detail. Instead, I will just tell you that this enables us to solve the equation and give us some output like this. So again, I've already showed you what the transition looks like, displacement of fossil fuels by renewables, consuming some fossil fuels to do so in the beginning of the transition. Now, all these historical emissions and the emissions that will persist into the future continue to drive some sea level rise. You can see that that is pretty much linear through 2100, resulting in 0.5 meter of sea level rise. And that's because of that linearity, because of the slow equilibration time of the oceans. All the sea level rise, according to our median case model runs, results in 31,000 kilometers of new coastal protection to an optimal protection height of around 1 meter on median, and 67 million people retreating. Again, lots of complexity around this number, but that's taking at face value our model output. And then all of these result in energy demands. So we can convert these all based on our modeling assumptions into embedded energy over time and in total. And I'll skip over that and just show you the emissions consequences. So for the sustainable energy transition itself, we burn a lot of coal, oil, and gas to get there at the beginning of the transition. That amounts to 75 gigatons of CO2. It's around 2 years of current emissions, and it's around 7% of our carbon budget. For adaptation, the order of magnitude is roughly 2 order of magnitude smaller here. So coastal protection globally, those 31,000 kilometers, looking at something like 1 gigaton of CO2, and retreat is around a quarter of that, together giving a fraction of a percent of the carbon budget. So emissions from the mitigation side larger than the adaptation side. And there are a few implications here that I want to talk about. So one of those is that what is the 7% of the carbon budget? Is that big or small? And I would argue that it's big from these two perspectives. So one, this 7% is around equivalent to 2 times the total emissions reductions that are attributable to global climate legislation over 1999 to 2016. So they're equivalent to a very large legislative effort. Pretty much all of our legislative effort that we've done so far, twice that. The 7% is also equivalent, according to my estimations, to the total emissions that would be saved by the United States reaching net zero by 2050. Okay, so that's equivalent to a very large technical effort, pretty much, what an ideal Green New Deal would look like. So I'd argue that this is actually pretty substantial, and therefore that we need to consider it, this kind of merger between mitigation goals and adaptation goals, as we think of this from a research and policy perspective. Another implication is that the total transition emissions are dominated by mitigation, and this makes it hard to avoid them. Because while there are natural alternatives, as we've seen in this session, to sea dikes, we could build, for instance, wetlands, sustain wetlands to provide us those protection goals. The energy seed for the transition, by contrast, needs to come from somewhere. Currently, that comes from fossil fuels. And I'll share with you one last implication, and these are around equity concerns. The transition emissions are disproportionately by wealthy countries and individuals. This is because they have more energy capacity to decarbonize. So there's more of that fossil fuel investment into solar and wind is going to wealthier individuals and countries. And there's also more protection of coastline where capital is more dense, at least according to my model, well, not the one I built, but the one I'm using, which is has a cost optimality assumption. Whereas lower income areas tend to be less protected, meaning they're bearing the emissions cost of other people's transition, which is unfortunately consistent with the kind of inequality that has characterized the whole climate crisis from the beginning. So I think this is, to editorialize a bit, just another reason why we need to be thinking about alternatives to cost optimality if we want to avoid those unfortunate outcomes or disastrous outcomes of the way the world has worked so far. So thanks a lot for your attention. Glad we have some time to hear the answers to the questions. If you want to get in touch with me, here is my email, Corey Lesk, and want to thank all these people who really gave me a big help with doing all this work.
Corey, I think you are frozen. I'm not sure if you can stop sharing the screen. There we go. Great. Thanks. Super. Thanks, everybody. Such interesting presentations. We have just a few minutes left. I see 3 questions that have come through. Let's open the first question because it's one that I think anybody can address. The first question is quite provocative. It's if there are limits to adaptation, is human bloodshed inevitable? That's quite directly stated. I think the rest of the panelists, by the way, you can put your videos back on so we can see everybody. Anybody want to take a crack at that? If adaptation is limited, what kind of harm can we expect?
I can maybe start. I think that's a little bit too much of a jump from limits of adaptation to bloodshed. I mean, limits of adaptation are usually like defined as or distinguished as soft adaptation limits, which are more related to governance and could also be finance. And then the hard limits, which are more like the biophysical limits in biophysical systems. But I think there are numerous other factors that lie between these adaptation limits and something like bloodshed. And of course, this is also where we have a lot of leverage to actually avoid bloodshed. So that's a bit too much of a jump for me.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? Okay, the other questions look like they're related to wildfire, so I think they could be for me or for Kimmy. If fire is not eligible for managed retreat, can we think of it as an additional risk factor? Could we somehow prioritize retreat in areas where there's an overlap between wildfire and flooding? So that's one question. And related, I think, are there policies or actions that can disincentivize further growth of the WUI to preemptively protect people? I'm going to jump on that second question because I think that's a really important question. I see Kimmy's nodding as well. What can we do to reduce further growth in the wildland urban interface? That issue falls almost entirely to local governments, potentially with state governments providing policies that guide local governments, but zoning and building requirements in the US are handled by local governments. And they run largely on property taxes. So they have a very complicated set of incentives driving their decision-making around limiting growth in high demand, high value areas. It's quite a complicated topic, and if they're weighing the cost of covering future damage from wildfire against the cost of losing property value, I don't know where they come out, but we've seen quite mixed results. Kimmy, do you have anything else to add on that one?
I would just dovetail what you said, Lisa, so well, that suppression costs spent by firefighters protecting homes is spent by the federal government. So as Lisa said, there's very little incentive for local jurisdictions to adopt regulations when they're not the ones that are going to front the bill for the firefighting costs. So it's this moral hazard in terms of they can approve all proposed developments because they're not the ones that are going to be footed with that bill. So I would just dovetail what you said, Lisa.
Yeah, although I do think that local governments and communities do shoulder quite a number of costs associated with catastrophic fires. They may not be on the front lines of paying for suppression costs, particularly when those fires originate on public lands, but they do suffer significantly from long-term damage to infrastructure, soils, productivity, and homes. Those costs, I think, do fall to local governments, but still they have a really complicated set of incentives driving their decision making. I'm quite attentive to everybody's time because I know there are back-to-back sessions. We are out of time. Speaking for myself, and I assume for others, we are reachable. So if we did not get to your question, if you want to reach out to us individually to continue this conversation, we welcome it. Thank you for attending and listening to our talks, and thanks to all the panelists.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a great
you.
day.
Bye-bye.